My buddy Roy had two Chevelles. The first one was a 1970 SS 454 LS6 engine, 450 horsepower. My name is Earl Kowalski, and I was working on the assembly line at Buick City in Flint when Roy bought that car used in 1973 for $1,100 because the original owner had wrapped it around a telephone pole and the insurance settlement had been generous. Roy straightened the nose, replaced the hood, and drove that car every single day until the frame rusted through in 1981. I rode in it hundreds of times. I remember exactly what it felt like when he put his foot down on the highway entrance ramp. Not the thrill of it, not the noise, just the physical sensation of the seat pressing into your back, like something had grabbed the car and decided it was going somewhere. Roy's younger brother Danny bought a 1975 Chevelle in the spring of 1976, also a 454, same displacement, same basic architecture, same name on the fender. We all went to look at it the day he brought it home. Roy drove it around the block. He came back, got out, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "They put the same badge on a different car and hoped nobody would notice." The 1975 454 made 215 horsepower. The 1970 454 made 450, same engine family, same cubic inches, half the power. And Danny had paid more for his than Roy had paid for his, adjusted for the inflation of those 5 years. That is the story of what happened to American muscle, not a dramatic announcement, not a press conference, just a slow, quiet substitution. The same names on diminished machines, until one day you looked up and the thing you remembered was gone. In 1972, I was 21 years old and working my first full year on the assembly line at Buick City in Flint. I had grown up around American engines the way some kids grow up around baseball. I knew the displacement numbers the way other men knew batting averages. I knew the difference between a 396 and a 427 by the sound. I knew which years were the good years and which ones were already compromised. I am telling you this because I was there. I watched it happen from the inside. And I want to explain, as precisely as I can, what was lost and why. Because most people who talk about this get the timeline wrong or the reasons wrong or both. You have to understand what these engines actually were before you can understand what was taken. In 1970, the peak year, General Motors offered the LS6 454 as an option in the Chevelle SS. It produced 450 horsepower at 5,600 revolutions per minute and 500 foot-pounds of torque at 3,600 revolutions per minute, measured by the gross SAE method of the time. It ran on 11.25:1 compression. It used a solid lifter camshaft with aggressive timing. It breathed through a 780 cubic feet per minute Holley 4-barrel carburetor. Of the roughly 4,475 LS6 engines produced, every one of them came out of GM's Tonawanda engine plant in New York. It was not a race engine. It was a production engine that you could walk into a Chevrolet dealership and order on a car for the street. Chrysler was selling the 426 Hemi. Ford was selling the Boss 429. Pontiac had the Ram Air 4. These were not exotic machines built for a handful of buyers. They were production vehicles made in the tens of thousands, available to any man who could make the payments. The engineers who built them had one directive: maximum performance within the constraints of durability and street reliability. They achieved it. They built engines that, maintained correctly, would produce that power for the life of the vehicle. 50 years later, a well-preserved LS6 still makes what it was rated to make. The metallurgy was correct. The engineering was correct. The only thing wrong with those engines, from Detroit's perspective, was that they were eventually no longer convenient to build. The compression ratio is where the story starts, and most people miss it. In the late 1960s, the oil companies began phasing out leaded premium gasoline as a political and environmental priority. Lead had been added to gasoline since the 1920s as an octane booster. It allowed engines to run higher compression ratios without detonating. The high-performance engines of the late 1960s depended on leaded premium. The LS6 required it. The Hemi required it. The manufacturers knew by 1969 that lead was going away. By 1971, they had already begun reducing compression ratios to run on the lower octane unleaded fuel that was becoming the new standard. The 454 that appeared in the 1971 Chevelle had a compression ratio of 9.0 to 1, down from 11.25, not because the engineers wanted to, because the fuel the car would have to run on for the rest of its life could not support the old ratio without destroying itself from detonation. Lower compression means lower power. The physics are not negotiable. You cannot make the same horsepower with 9.0 to 1 compression that you made with 11.25, all other things equal. They tried to compensate with carburation and cam timing adjustments. It was not enough. Then came 1972, and the measurement changed. In 1972, the Society of Automotive Engineers changed the standard for measuring engine output from gross to net horsepower. Gross horsepower was measured with the engine on a stand, stripped of its accessories, running without an air cleaner, without an exhaust system, without the alternator and power steering pump that rob power in real operation. Net horsepower was measured as installed in the vehicle, with all accessories attached, through the production exhaust system. Net horsepower is the honest number. It is what the engine actually produces in your car. Gross horsepower was, by any reasonable measure, a marketing figure. When GM applied the new measurement method to the same engines they had been selling, the numbers dropped dramatically. The 454 that had been rated at 365 gross horsepower in 1971 was rated at 270 net horsepower in 1972. Same engine. The power had not changed. The number had. But most buyers in 1972 did not understand that. They saw smaller numbers on the spec sheet and concluded that the engines had gotten worse. The manufacturers quietly were comfortable with this confusion. Smaller numbers attracted less attention from the insurance companies and the regulators who were already beginning to ask questions about high-performance vehicles. It was not a lie exactly. The new numbers were more accurate, but the timing was not coincidental. By 1973, four forces had converged on the American performance engine simultaneously, and none of them were going to relent. President Nixon had established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and signed the Clean Air Act, two actions that set the regulatory clock ticking on every high-compression V8 in Detroit's lineup. Emission standards for 1975 required catalytic converters on all new passenger vehicles. Catalytic converters required unleaded fuel exclusively. The lead that remained in the premium grades would poison the catalyst. And catalytic converters, to function properly, required exhaust temperatures and oxygen content that were incompatible with the aggressive cam timing and rich fuel mixtures that produced peak power. The engine had to be detuned at the source to keep the converter functioning at all. The Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, enacted by Congress in the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 following the oil embargo, required manufacturers to achieve a fleet average of 18 miles per gallon by 1978, rising to 27.5 by 1985. A 454 cubic inch V8 making 450 horsepower does not achieve 18 miles per gallon under any conditions. If you wanted to sell that engine in your lineup, every other vehicle in your fleet had to compensate. The arithmetic worked against displacement and compression. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973, Arab member nations cutting off exports in response to the Yom Kippur War, was the public face of the change that the regulatory environment had already made inevitable behind the scenes. When gasoline lines appeared and fuel prices doubled, the cultural permission to build and buy a car whose primary virtue was the sensation of velocity, that permission evaporated in a season. And then there was the insurance industry. After the accident statistics of 1969 and 1970, years when high-horsepower vehicles were involved in a disproportionate share of fatal crashes, the insurance companies began surcharging young male drivers of high-performance vehicles at rates that made the cars effectively unaffordable for the buyers who most wanted them. The manufacturers felt this in sales. The Chevelle SS, the Cuda, the Torino Cobra, their sales dropped sharply in 1971 and 1972, not only because buyers were changing, but because the cost to own them had changed. Four forces. None of them were reversible on any short timeline. Detroit made a calculation, and the calculation was rational. The market for maximum performance engines had been destroyed by events largely outside their control, and rebuilding it would require a regulatory and cultural environment that did not exist. So they stopped building for it. By 1976, the Camaro Z28 had been discontinued. The Pontiac GTO, which had started the muscle car era in 1964, was gone. The Corvette, was producing 180 horsepower. A 1976 Corvette made less power than a modern Honda Accord. The Mustang had become a Pinto with different sheet metal. The men who were in their 20s and 30s in 1970 watched this happen over 6 years, not all at once, a little every year. A compression ratio here, a cam timing change there, a net rating instead of a gross rating, a smaller carburetor mandated by the emissions equipment. You did not wake up one morning and find that American muscle had disappeared. You woke up one morning and realized it had been gone for a while and you had not noticed the exact moment it left. Roy noticed. He noticed the day Danny brought that 1975 Chevelle home. I have been asked many times over the years whether Detroit could have done something different, whether the engineers had alternatives they chose not to pursue, whether the performance era had to end the way it did. The honest answer is that some of what happened was genuinely outside their control. The lead phase-out was not negotiable. The emission standards were law. The OPEC embargo was a geopolitical event. You cannot engineer your way past those constraints in the short term, but some of it was a choice. The manufacturers chose to use the regulatory transition as cover for cost reductions that had nothing to do with emissions. They chose to put the same badges on detuned vehicles rather than develop new performance strategies within the new constraints. They chose, in a period of genuine engineering pressure, to stop competing on the dimension that their best customers most valued. The engineers at GM and Ford and Chrysler in 1972 were not incapable of building a high-performance engine that met the new regulations. They proved this eventually. The engines that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, once the engineers had time and resources and manufacturer commitment, were excellent. The LS1 in the 1997 Corvette made 345 horsepower and met every emission standard of its era, a direct descendant of the same engine family that powered Roy's car, refined over 3 decades. The technology existed. The will to develop it, in the mid-1970s, did not. What was lost in those 6 years was not recoverable on the original terms. The specific combination of large displacement, high compression, mechanical simplicity, and accessible power that defined the American performance engine of 1965 to 1970, that combination was a product of a specific moment in regulatory history and fuel chemistry that will not return. The unleaded mandate, the emission standards, the CAFE requirements, those did not go away. The engines that existed before them were artifacts of a world that no longer exists. Roy kept his 1970 Chevelle until the frame gave out. He never bought another car he liked as much. I asked him about it once, near the end of his life. He said, "It wasn't that they couldn't build it anymore. It was that they decided you didn't need it. And once they decided that, they were done thinking about you. I have thought about that for 40 years. He was right. The engineers who built the LS6 were building for a driver who wanted the maximum that mechanical engineering could deliver within the constraints of road use. That driver, his needs, his preferences, his right to choose a machine on those terms, stopped being the person Detroit was designing for sometime around 1972. You can buy a fast car today. The technology is remarkable. A modern Camaro SS will outperform that 1970 Chevelle on every measurable dimension: acceleration, handling, braking, fuel economy, reliability. I am not arguing otherwise, But you cannot buy what Roy had. Not new, not from Detroit. The specific thing that car was, the directness of it, the sense that nothing stood between the driver and the full output of the machine, the feeling of physical consequence that came from 500 foot-pounds of torque with no electronic management between your right foot and the rear wheels. That is gone. They built it for about 6 years. Then they decided you didn't need it anymore. Roy knew it the day he drove Danny's Chevelle around the block and came back and didn't say anything. Some things, once you've had them, you always know when they're missing.